Randomised Gaming.
Hello and welcome to the video version of Randomised Gaming's Volume 20 review. This video covers our review of Castlevania II Simon's Quest, or as it was known in Japan, Dracula II Seal of the Cursed. Castlevania II was originally released on the Famicom Disk System accessory in Japan and actually used the Disk System format. For the Western release, it was converted to cartridge for the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was published and developed by Konami. It was first released in 1987, and the genre falls into platform cum RPG, and the platform elements form into a very similar to Metroid game, or Metroidvania as many people like to call the genre. Randomised Gaming reviewed the original European Nintendo Entertainment System version of Castlevania II Simon's Quest on both the original NES at 50Hz with a PAL cartridge and on the Wii U Virtual Console at 60Hz using a digital download version from the Virtual Console. If you ask any uninformed fan of the Castlevania series, known just as Dracula in Japan or Akumido Dracula for some of the later games, what do you think of Castlevania II Simon's Quest? You will likely get a response along the lines of, "That's the rubbish one on the NES." Sadly, that's the all too common line you hear on the game, even from some fellow reviewers, many of whom sound like they've played Castlevania II all for 5 minutes and decide that it must be a bad game as it plays differently to the original Castlevania, often appearing to give up on the game after about 20 minutes of play or so, or just throwing the joypad at the wall at the slightest hint of frustration. Although ironically it has to be said, in many ways Castlevania II is far less annoying than its predecessor on the NES and the third game in the series that followed it. Having finished both, I found the first and the third one far more tedious than I ever did the second game. In fact, this is a good example of how a hardcore fanbase can actually damage the design and evolution of a franchise, as fans will often cry foul at the mere hint of change, even if that change is actually for the better, while at the same time lapping up identical sequels that don't take the series forward in any meaningful direction or in terms of game design. And ultimately these type of generic by the numbers sequels tend to ultimately cost franchise sales in the long run, as the franchise rapidly becomes stale and boring, as everyone gets sick of playing the same game time after time. During the late 80s and early 90s, games companies were far more willing to make braver design choices, in part due to the much lower cost of games development back then and the fact that many studios were making multiple titles at once, even if it meant making a game very different from the previous titles in the series. Konami did just that with Castlevania II when they originally released it, and as a result Castlevania II sits alongside games such as Zelda 2 The Adventure of Link, Fire Emblem Gaiden on NES, Resident Evil 4 and Final Fantasy XII, all of which break the current and existing series mould and do something a bit different from the previous games in this franchise. Now, these new titles don't always work, and all the formerly mentioned games have plenty of flaws in them, but they do also do a lot of things very right, and it's fair to say the previous games in all the aforementioned series also have their own set of problems. And for better or worse, many may prefer these altered changes, other fans may not. Historically, Konami's 1980 home games tended to have a very arcade feel in design, of course owing to their arcade heritage. The first Castlevania stayed true to this heritage and is a fast-paced action platformer that sees you fighting across 6 stages to defeat Dracula and his minions. Each stage is divided up into a number of sections and each has its own unique boss and enemy types to face. The game itself, you only used 2 buttons, one for attack and the other for jump, very much like the controls you would see in most arcade games with 2 or 3 buttons at max. Much like any arcade game as well, Castlevania can also be finished in around an hour and is very easy to pick up and play. If you were expecting a straight sequel to the original Castlevania on NES, you would be sorely disappointed with Castlevania II, as Castlevania II itself is clearly heavily inspired by 2 earlier released Famicom Disk System games in the form of Zelda 2 Link's Adventure and Metroid, both of which had been released within the previous year. It's not hard to see why some Castlevania fans hate Castlevania II, as the start is very different from the previous game, seeing Simon Belmont arrive in a town and able to talk with various NPCs who live there. You were also given the choice to freely explore the village and the surrounding areas of the game at your own pace, giving the game a much more open world RPG feel than its predecessor. Compare this to the original game, on the other hand, which saw you being thrown straight into the first stage of Dracula's castle, knee-deep in zombies and plenty of other monsters. Just because one title in a series is different to the previous installments doesn't mean it should be treated like some possessed monster that's threatening to blow up the world and shunned at parties and every other opportunity. If you liked the original Castlevania, then you're more likely to enjoy Castlevania III, Dracula Curse on NES. That said, Dracula Curse itself is a little bit of a hybrid of both previous NES games, and for games closest to the original Castlevania, you probably want to pick up Super Castlevania IV on SNES, Castlevania Chronicles on PlayStation 1, and Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth on Wii, as these are the closest titles in gameplay and mechanics to the original. Now that I've covered that point, if you're still complaining about the fact that Castlevania II is different from the first game, then the only other bit of advice I have for you is this: don't buy it. Approaching and playing Castlevania II Simon's Quest as a game is somewhat different to other titles in the series, as I previously mentioned. This is not a pick up and play arcade game like the original title was. This is a game that will instead absorb hours of your life as you wander Transylvania in search of Dracula's body parts. This is an open world platformer and roleplay game hybrid that forces you to interact and explore the world like no other game in the series does. To start with, you do well to grab yourself a pen and paper, as you're going to need to keep a map of your adventure. Secondly, see that NES box you took the cartridge out? Well, inside it is something called a manual, and before you do anything, open it up and read every page. It's going to teach you a thing or two about the game and the items you need on your adventure. And if you're lucky enough to have the digital download version, then press the home button on the console and bring up the digital manual and read it from there. Oh, and if for any reason you don't have a manual, then it's going to be a bit of a bumpy start. It's amazing the things we had to do when playing a video game back in the 80s and 90s when they didn't hold your hand from the very start. Unlike some of the later towns in the game, Jova, the first town, provides you with some good information to get started. However, the game does have two core problems from the outset that do hinder your progress in the game. First is the poor quality of the English dialogue from the villagers, with much of it being random gibberish at best. "Don't look into the Death Star or you will die" is one catchy piece of dialogue, but a nod to Star Wars isn't going to help anyone. Neither are the lines "hit Deborah Cliff with your head to make a hole" or "to restore life, shout in front of the church." Part of the reason for this is the fact that the Japanese text in the Famicom Disk System release is also little better than gibberish. The reason for this is the other big bugbear I have with the game, and that is that many of the core mechanics are either poorly explained or unexplained in the game entirely. One of these hidden game mechanics that the manual hints at but doesn't fully explain is that each different type of non-player character in the town has different odds of telling the truth or not. The manual just mentions about the odd town prankster, when in fact the sprite used for the NPC is the key to knowing whether what they're going to be saying will be useful to the player or not. Old men NPCs largely give you good advice around 75% of the time. Young men NPCs largely give you good advice around 50% of the time, and young women and old women NPCs only give you good advice around 25% of the time. Finally, gypsies will always offer to sell you or trade items with you that will help you in your journey. As the previously mentioned three quotes all come from NPCs, it's fair to say they are all lies. For example, another NPC from a different village tells you this: "You look pale, my son, you must rest in the church." So we can tell from that line that the quote about shouting in front of the church is a lie. Most of the real clues and hints and tips of the game in fact come from the 13 clue books, or tombs as they're also known, that are hidden inside secret walls throughout the game, or all over the world, that can only be accessed by throwing holy water at them. These clues are vital if you plan to finish the game, and include hints such as clear a path at Berkeley Mansion with a white crystal, to replenish Earth, kneel by the lake with the blue crystal, and wait for the soul with a red crystal on Deborah Cliff. These clues are still a little bit cryptic, but they give you a very good idea as to what to do at certain locations. Some other reviewers mistakenly seem to think that the previously mentioned Deborah Cliff dialogue is a mistranslation about hit your head on Deborah's Cliff. It isn't, rather it is intended as an insult to Simon, as it comes from a female NPC who thinks Simon is trying to chat her up. The Japanese text for that NPC is also largely the same, so finding the clue books hidden in game is vital to working out what the red crystal actually does. While it's fair to say that one or two of the clue books are badly translated, the ones that are only minor ones relating to a couple of bonus weaponry. If trying to solve clues, puzzles and riddles isn't your thing, then this is not a game for you. But as someone who grew up on the Dizzy Adventure games, it's very much my cup of tea. There's something quite exciting and indeed euphoric the moment you solve a puzzle for the first time, especially if you've been lost at it for the past 30 or so minutes as to what to do. Ultimately, many gamers may decide to use a guide, and there's no real shame in that. It really depends on how much time you have to explore the game fully, as finishing the game without a guide will probably take around 10 to 15 hours and involve throwing a lot of holy water around. In many ways, the game has an 80s 90s home computer feeling in some of the aspects of its game's design, certainly in the way you have to explore the world to figure out and solve the problems at hand. Combat works just the same as any other Castlevania. Outside of the town, various monsters block your path, from skeletons, werewolves, mummies and the series favourites such as Medusa heads. Most can be dealt with a few well-timed whip strikes, but as this is an open world game, the strength of the enemy grows the closer you get to Dracula's castle. So running off to Deborah's Cliffs without an upgraded whip and a few level ups to your name is just asking for trouble. As with any good Castlevania, there's even a few boss fights, but with only 3 bosses in the game, Death, Camilla and Dracula, most of the dungeons in game are rather anticlimactic, with little more than an empty room with an orb in it when you reach the end. Weapon upgrades and secondary weapons are also permanent this time around, and you can freely change between them at any point once you've obtained the items in question. Only consumable items need to be repurchased, so you only ever need to keep an eye on how many laurels and garlic you are currently carrying. Although you can also only hold 1 oak stake at any time, and this has to be used to obtain a body part of Dracula from each dungeon, hence why in a rather bizarre setup they are only ever sold in castles and dungeons. And often, as you'll find in the later dungeons, the seller of the oak stake is hidden away in a secret room, making it particularly aggravating trying to find them. Collectible hearts once again act as ammunition for sub-weapons, however this time round they also act as the local currency and as an experience point tracker, making them a key tool for both trading with gypsies and for increasing Simon's power. Likely due to a quirk in binary, you can only hold 256 hearts at any one time however, so if you plan on buying a Morning Star whip, best not to go crazy with the sub-weapons while you're saving up for it. The level up system that goes along with heart collecting is also fairly restrictive. You gain your first level at 100 XP and after that at every 50 to 100 intervals. What's not made clear to the player however is that all monsters have their own hidden level stats, and once Simon's level is above a monster's level, hearts dropped by that monster will no longer award experience points, just currency. It's also fairly easy to reach the maximum level in-game, even if it does require a bit of heart farming in the last castle. While levelling up Simon isn't required, it does make the game slightly easier due to the increased health, attack and defense you gain. Death in Castlevania II is nothing to be feared, as you can continue from the spot where you died. removing any gameplay frustration and giving the game a very smooth and balanced difficulty, very much in the same manner as the series' golden child Castlevania Symphony of the Night does, which is in direct contrast to Castlevania 1 and 3 on the NES, which both make plenty of use of trial and error gameplay, along with trying to knock you into an instant death trap at almost every moment. Both games are not for the quick to anger, as they deliberately use these frustrating gameplay tricks to slow your progress in-game, something Castlevania II never does. Yes, there are the odd cheeky moment like invisible holes in the floor and secret walls you can walk through in the odd dungeon, but these tricks aren't overly used and you won't find yourself unceremoniously dumped back at the start of each stage when you lose a life. Finally, it's best we don't discuss the golden dagger death drops, as it's the best secondary weapon in the game and can be used to stun lock and quickly finish any enemy in the game, including Dracula. So if you want to kill off any remaining challenge, just equip it. While the original Japanese Famicom disk system release included a save system, this has been replaced with a password system for the NES version. This password system allows you to continue from the town of Jova with all your collected items and gear intact. This is a much needed feature, as you certainly won't be finishing Castlevania II in a single sitting first time around. Another huge part of the game is the day and night system. At first glance it appears just to act to create a real-time world feeling, however secretly it also affects which of the endings the player will see upon finishing the game. The in-game clock can be checked in the inventory menu, and during the hours of 6 AM to 1800 PM the world is in daylight. During these hours monsters have reduced health and you can converse with the townsfolk. When night falls, however, the townsfolk border up their doors as the town becomes overrun with monsters, and all world map enemies also see increase into health and damage. The night can be a lonely time in this world, as even the church won't allow you to enter, preventing you from restoring your health. This clever system makes for interesting gameplay, as timing when and where you travel is vital if you plan to finish the game within 8 days to see the best ending, as the last thing you want is to arrive at a village in the dead of night and have to wait until morning before you can heal up and trade for essential items. The in-game timer takes around 10 minutes to cover a full day. However, the clock remains static inside buildings and dungeons. One complaint that should be mentioned is the lack of a world map both in-game or in the manual. While drawing your own map might be fun, it's not what a gamer wants to do, and this is in fact an oversight by Konami's North American and European branches, as a map was included in the Japanese manual, and it should also have been included in the Western one. Without it, exploring the world is a bit of a daunting task at first, and you can also miss a few major location clues as a result to where certain castles are in-game. Despite the complaints of some fans, Castlevania II's mechanics, both new and old, work really well together. The day and night system encourages players to keep moving and thinking about where they're going, while the huge open world map and hidden secrets force you to explore every nook and cranny of the game. Controls are as tight and rigid as the first game, and the jumping is the same pixel perfect weighted feel as well. Weapon collision is also pretty much spot on, and every hit you take feels like it's down to your own mistakes. The puzzles and clues also test you to the max, although sometimes a little too much. The game in many ways is perhaps a little too ambitious. There is no question it is a big game and far bigger than the original. That comes at a cost, and the graphics and music do suffer as a result, as it appears that Konami were getting a bit low on space for some aspects of the game. The graphics themselves look good for a NES title, with some nice bold and well drawn 2D sprites, with all the various monsters looking very different to one another. There's not a huge amount of animation in many of the sprites, however, but that's par of the course for early NES games. It's fair to say that games like Kirby's Adventure are far more animated in comparison, but then that was also a much later title. One thing to note is that some sprites do seem slightly smaller than a few of their counterparts from the original game. The bigger enemies from the first game, like the skeleton dragons, have been scaled back somewhat. Even Death looked like he's been on a bit of a gaming diet. What does become apparent is the heavy reuse of some of the monster sprites. Castles and dungeons primarily only use the same 4 enemies, which include skeletons, knights, gargoyles and slime leeches. The odd bat and spider can be found in a few of the later dungeons for good measure as well. What's strange about this is the fact there are a huge number of different types of monsters on the world map. Wolves, flame men and man-eating plants each only appear in 1 or 2 scenes, whereas mummies, dragon heads, Medusa heads, ravens and zombies are just some of the many monsters that only appear in the open world. It makes for some needlessly bland castles and just leaves you guessing as to why this is when they have a huge range of monsters available, why there's only 4 in most of the dungeons. The level design and background art also suffers from much the same issues. As nice as they look, the backgrounds are reused far too much. All the castles use the same tile set, just in different colours, whereas the original Castlevania used a different theme for each stage, making you feel as if you're exploring ruined hallways, walking atop the battlements, crawling through dimly lit caves, and climbing the rusty clogs of the old clock tower. That's all gone, replaced at large with the same forest or dead forest background in the open world. The towns do much the same trick as the castle, just largely change colour, and the inside of houses all use the same layout and format regardless of which town you're in. Castles also use the same type of level design and most follow a square box layout, so don't expect any interesting tower designs like the rather awesome clock tower seen in Castlevania III. One of the stranger quirks of the level design is in fact the boss rooms, as you can actually walk past Death and Camilla when you finally face them. Indeed, you can just leave them hanging in mid-air as they take a few seconds to actually come down and start attacking you. Quite why the game doesn't just lock you in the boss room until you defeated them and taken the equipment they drop is a bit of a mystery. It seems an odd way to do it, and even more bizarre is the fact that as you have to backtrack in Castlevania II upon collecting Dracula's body part, if you actually decide to fight Camilla or Death on the way in, when you then go back into the room upon collecting Dracula's body part, they will have respawned, making these boss encounters all the more strange, as effectively you can fight them over and over again as many times as you like. Looking at the overall open world layout in Castlevania II, it feels like Konami spent a lot of time planning how the open world was going to play and look, and towards the development, once they really got into the development cycle, it looks like they really realised they had to make a lot of cuts in order to pack everything they wanted to do into the actual game, and the amount of repetition within the game is clearly a sign of this. It's a shame, as I think had Castlevania II been made now, it would be absolutely stunning. Whatever Konami's reasons behind these decisions, they do drag down the overall quality of the game on the entertainment system, and you can't help feeling that Castlevania II in many areas feels a lot less polished than the original Castlevania. The sound effects and music are both top class stuff. The sound design shows that even on an 8-bit console you can still achieve great things. Simon's whip has satisfactory lash sound, and there's a clear thud after every jump, and there's plenty of other standard noises for killing enemies, picking up power-ups and even levelling up. A few grunts and shouts from the enemies would have been nice, but other than that the sound effects achieve their task very well for a late 80s NES game. On the soundtrack, it's worth remembering that Konami actually altered the music for the NES release, though the music itself is slightly different on the original Famicom Disk System version. The highlight in this game is of course the daytime theme of Bloody Tears, a series classic and a song written for this game. Most gamers will end up rocking their heads to its beats as you venture around Transylvania. There are some other great music tracks in there as well, and it's a NES game that really tries to deal with the constraints of the console sound hardware. There is one problem, however, and that's the lack of music, as most tunes are heavily repeated. Bloody Tear plays absolutely everywhere on the world map in daytime, and the theme Cursed Monster Dance is the same for the night. After about 3 hours or so of listening to both, you get a bit sick of hearing them and zone out to the music. Towns also use the same theme, and only dungeons have a couple of different music tracks, but again they are repeated at least once in another dungeon. The final battle with Dracula and the ending also actually have their own music songs, but you don't hear them till right at the end of the game. Even Death and the Camilla boss battles lack their own music, killing much of the atmosphere traditionally seen in boss battles in the Castlevania series, as there's no epic theme to go along with these battles. So finally we come to Randomised Gaming's summing up of Castlevania II, Simon's Quest. And I suppose the big question is it an uneasy mix of new ideas that doesn't quite work in the game, or is there actually some reason behind the mad rants of crazed fans averse to change? Okay, so be brutally honest, Castlevania II is not without its flaws, but when you reflect and weigh up on the pros versus the cons, Castlevania II has plenty more going for it than against. In fact, in many areas it blows the first NES game out of the water entirely. Until now, this review has kept the mention of Castlevania's Symphony of the Night to a minimum, and the reason for that is to let readers understand how Simon's Quest works, as large parts of this review's text could have been dumped straight from a review of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, as it almost wholesale borrows almost all the gameplay mechanics from Castlevania II. Even the ferryman cameos in both games. Symphony just takes the advantage of being a bigger game with more polish and a ton of extra junk to collect. Seriously, Acula'd be a walking tombstone by the end of Symphony with all the gear he's carrying. Simon, on the other hand, just packed his bags with only the required equipment he needed. Castlevania II was perhaps a tad ambitious for a 1987 game, and the lack of cartridge/disc space for the time shows up with some of the game's design. I can't help but feel had this been made in say 91, 92, when cartridges were much bigger, many of the flaws would have been removed or addressed. Yet even with the final game as it is, when you compare it to the original NES Metroid, Simon's Quest hugely improves on that rather messy and almost unplayable title. I mean, having actually finished the original Metroid not long after doing Simon's Quest, I found the original Metroid to be a wholly unpleasant, bland and just really ugly experience. The development team at the time clearly set out to make a game better than Metroid, and they did, in some style. Even Metroid 2 is a far weaker game than Simon's Quest, as both early Metroid games suffer from major copy and paste map design issues, and it's often quite tricky to even work out where you're going. It's fair to say that the now coined phrase of Metroidvania is often mistakenly used for Castlevania Symphony of the Night, when instead that term should actually refer to this game, Castlevania II Simon's Quest. Some of the purists among you might be raising your hand now going, hang on, what about the MSX title Vampire Killer? Well, Vampire Killer was actually a tweaked port of the original Castlevania, and it used stage design, but the caveat is, unlike the NES Castlevania, you could backtrack in Vampire Killer. The problem is it still used stage design, so once you finished one stage you went on to the next, and it was still pretty limited. It wasn't open world like Simon's Quest or Symphony of the Night. You can't in Vampire Killer go from the very opening section all the way to the final boss and traverse there and back again. While finishing the game without resorting to looking at a guide even once is rather tricky, it's not impossible. Yes, the English translation isn't great, but most of the problems come from the poorly or unexplained game mechanics like the clue books and Konami's oversight in not including and translating the Japanese map which was featured in the manual. Indeed, Konami sabotaged much of the game review themselves by not including the information that was featured in the Japanese manual. And many of the complaints raised by Western gamers I suspect may have not been raised had this all been properly translated and included in the manual originally. Overall, Castlevania II actually blends together pretty well and is a very open and enjoyable game. It is very much a love it or hate it game because it's more an RPG and puzzle and adventure game than anything else. So if you're a fan of Symphony of the Night, you're probably likely to enjoy Simon's Quest more than if you're a fan of the original Castlevania. Because if you want a short arcade game that you can pick up and play straight away, then this is not the game for you and you should skip over it. If, like me, you'll enjoy RPGs and puzzles or like games that don't hold you by the hand, then this is right up my street, and as a result I really enjoyed it. Of the three Castlevania games on the NES, Simon's Quest I found to be the most well balanced, as the original Castlevania is actually far too short, it can be finished in an hour. Castlevania III, on the other hand, Dracula's Curse, makes the difficulty as obtuse and obnoxious as possible to try and increase the game's length, to the point where it becomes rather tedious to play on later stages, spoiling the good design of the earlier levels. In many ways, Simon's Quest is the best of the bunch on NES, and certainly the one I had the most fun playing through. It's also the most forward-looking of the series in games design, as even the later 16-bit games such as Super Castlevania and Round of Blood for the large part stick with the original Castlevania's gameplay, and there are some very nice ideas in Castlevania 2. In the end, I'm left feeling that Castlevania 2 largely gets a bad rap for no good reason. Yes, it has problems, but so does just about every good NES game. Nothing's perfect. I suspect if this had just been called Simon's Quest, a Castlevania RPG, the game would have been more fairly treated by many fans. As it stands, If, like me, you enjoy a game that takes time to discover its secrets and get your brain cells working as to where you need to go next, then you'll have a lot of fun with this classic. As for that monster that fans ignore at the party, well, if you sat down and actually chat with him, you might discover he's rather friendly and not as menacing as everyone else makes out. It also turns out he's the father of the super popular kid, as without Simon's Quest, there would have been no Symphony of the Night. Indeed, it's fair to say that Symphony of the Night borrows huge amounts of gameplay elements from Castlevania II. Yes, Symphony does it better, but Simon's Quest is still the original. Thanks for listening to this randomised gaming review. I have been Random Gamer Riven. Hope you've enjoyed it. Please do like, sub, etc. Explain whether you agree, disagree with us as well in the comments section. You can find in the video description all the links and material we used for sourcing information on Simon's Quest 2. There's some translation sites and there's a couple of sites explaining from Japan that we saw that explained how the game worked. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.